According to the Sentencing Project, over the last 40 years, there has been a 500% increase of incarcerations in the United States. Although people of color only make up 12% of our population, they make up 37% of our prison population. From the passing of the 13th Amendment to today's prison industrial complex, people of color have continuously faced systemic racism in the United States. We're often taught about the lengths taken to try to end racial discrimination, but rarely do we see the ugly realities of how racism hides in the legislation that has led to this mass incarceration of those in the Black community. This horrifying reality is not often spoken of in most of our history classes. I only learned about these injustices recently in my American Studies and Gender Women's Studies courses in college. Today, I will inform you of how changes in law and policy have allowed for the systemic oppression of the Black community in the United States. First, I will explain the loophole written into our 13th Amendment and discuss the impacts of the Jim Crow laws. Next, I will discuss the legislation passed during the war on drugs, and I'll explain how these changes led to mass incarceration and the privatization of prisons, which disproportionately impacts the Black community. The 13th Amendment is known to have abolished slavery. It's meant to be the greatest emancipation. But what they do not tell us is that there is a loophole, which in turn legalizes state-owned slavery. According to the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, slavery was abolished, except as a punishment for crime. The 13th Amendment also did not signify an end to racist ideologies. Therefore, this loophole meant newly freed slaves could then easily be charged for a few low-level crimes in order to be convicted and forced to once again work for free. Unfortunately, since people of color were freed from servitude, the United States decided that that meant they needed to have laws which would label them as second-class citizens, Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws legalized the separation of Black and white folks. This made sure they knew that they were still not equal due to their skin color. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson legalized this, stating that they were separate but equal. This separation could be seen in public schools, transportation, housing, bathrooms, and even water fountains. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica article on Jim Crow, these separations legalized racialized desegregation from 1877 to 1964. Although the Jim Crow laws were overturned through the Civil Rights Act of 1965, Nixon and Reagan's war on drugs established new laws and procedures which legalized the imprisonment of people of color, frequently for petty, non-violent, drug-related crimes. Following the civil rights movement in which the Black community fought for equality, President Nixon declared drugs to be America's public enemy number one. Since then, Nixon's domestic policy chief, John L. Richmond, stated this in an interview in 1994. "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them, night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." This ideology, however, persisted and was taken to the next level when President Reagan shifted the focus from treatment to criminal punishment in the 80s. The Sentencing Project shows a chart from Bureau of Statistics which shows that the number of people incarcerated for drug offenses went from 40,900 in 1980 to 452,964 people in 2017. This war led to more laws criminalizing low-level drugs and giving harder sentences for crimes of poverty, which directly hurt marginalized communities and people of color. Laws like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 created a series of mandatory minimums for various drug offenses. Mandatory minimums depended on the drug. For example, 5 grams of crack meant 5 years in prison, while it would take 500 grams of cocaine on the hand to reach that sentence as well. Funny how 80% of crack users were African Americans. This is just one example of how communities of color were disproportionately affected by this legislation. Today, incarceration from drug conviction makes up nearly half of our prisons, and oddly enough, the first private prison was opened in 1984. As the number of incarcerated persons skyrocketed following the war on drugs, the need for prisons grew. Corporations saw this and took advantage by creating privatized prisons. They claim to be saving the government money. Meanwhile, their true goal is to profit with cheap labor costs. According to the Justice Policy Institute, inmate employees make over $5,000 less than their government counterparts and receive 58 fewer hours of training. The current acts of the criminal justice system and the prison industrial complex are results of years of legislation that bear a history of racist ideals. In conclusion, today I have informed you on the political institutions and legislation that has allowed for systemic racism to continue in the United States. I have highlighted how moments of history meant to create positive change, such as the 13th Amendment and the war on drugs, had a dark underlying motive which resulted in mass incarceration and the privatization of prisons, which disproportionately affect people of color. These historical events, viewed in subjunction, tell an unfortunate story. From slave to second-class citizen, and finally, to a marginalized community that has been unjustly targeted for crime. Today, the Bureau of Justice Statistics shows that 1 in 3 Black men are likely to be imprisoned in their lifetime, and that they are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white man. When we discuss the history of the United States, it is important to see the whole history and consider why it is these communities are marginalized. Education on these issues will allow us to be aware of the injustice and to actively work to create a more equal society.